Okay, first a quick introduction. IP&R is short for Integrated Planning and Reporting, which is the strategic planning and reporting framework for New South Wales councils. Current requirements are defined in the New South Wales Local Government Act via amendments which came in 2009, with all councils having to comply by 2012. The OLG also issued a set of IP&R guidelines and a manual which prescribes further requirements. The latest version of the manual was issued in 2013. It's important to note, though, that some significant changes were made in 2016 with the Local Government Amendment Governance and Planning Act. It's perhaps hard to believe, but after 5 years, these have mostly not commenced. But I'm told by the Minister's Office and OLG they will soon. This presentation is based on the 2016 amendments, but be aware that a new IP&R manual and guidelines will be out soon, and these will define further requirements. So the next cycle of IP&R officially begins after the elections in September, but I'd argue that you need to start work on this now because there's simply not enough time after the elections to start from scratch. So what does the IP&R framework actually look like? I'd imagine most people working in the industry would have seen this from the IP&R manual. This community engagement informing the community strategic plan, and then that informing the delivery program, an operational plan, and onto the annual report. I'll be highlighting elements of this that need significant revision in light of the 2016 amendments to the Act as we go. But first, why bother? I hope to encourage you to get actively involved in your next round of IP&R after the elections, and in fact I'd argue we engineers should play a leadership role in IP&R. We're responsible for delivering many of the services different communities consistently tell their councils they value most, and we're the ones responsible for spending a large chunk of the budget and for looking after most of council's physical assets. I think this is one of the main reasons engineers don't get as involved in IP&R as they could and should, is the philosophy that underpins the original approach to IP&R. A case in point here is the first version of documents at Coffs Harbour, where I was directed when I got interested in this stuff. As my staff were quick to point out to me, the CSP doesn't even mention water supply and sewerage, so where is its relevance to us? And this wasn't an isolated issue. Another council I was working with recently hadn't even noticed that there were no actions in its operational plan relating to water supply and sewerage until I pointed it out. One of the biggest hurdles I expect you'll encounter in leading better IP&R practice at your council is that everyone thinks they know what IP&R is about. Challenging their thinking won't be easy, but the arguments I'll be giving you are straight from the Act, which is surely the most solid foundation for better practice. The Act was amended for good reason. The latest amendments include some fundamental changes right up front, where the old council's charter was replaced with new principles for local government. The Act defines the objective of these principles as being to provide guidance to enable councils to carry out their functions in a way that facilitates local communities that are strong, healthy and prosperous. This picks up on 2 points that I'll return to throughout this presentation. They are Council's Plan, the delivery program, which is about Council's functions, and the Community's Plan, the Community Strategic Plan, which is about what strong, healthy and prosperous looks like to our local community, and strategies for all stakeholders in that community to work together towards that objective. Fundamental to better practice I'll be outlining today is that councils must distinguish between these two things. They are closely related, but in the original approach to IP&R, they were basically treated as the same thing. It may sound like an argument over wording, so to explain this a bit more clearly, let's just look at the section of the Act that specifically describes what the delivery program is about. Originally, the Act defined the DP simply in terms of council's activities to implement the strategies established by the CSP. That's exactly what the traditional IP&R diagram emphasises. The CSP is the gospel and it tells council everything it needs to do, and this is what goes into the DP. This figure from the IP&R manual reinforced this philosophy. In fact, the guidelines specifically required that the delivery program directly address the objectives and strategies of the CSP and identify specific actions that council will undertake in response to those objectives and strategies. That's why most councils ended up with something like this. The CSP identifies a number of quadruple bottom line themes. So social is healthy and active, environmental, an economic theme, and lastly, strong leadership, civic leadership. But a lot of councils also had this quality built-in environment or infrastructure themes. Then the actions in the delivery program were pigeonholed within each of these themes. But most councils retained the program-based structure of their budgets. What this meant was that there was no clear alignment between the actions in the DP and programs in the budget. So, for example, if we started with this council's budget for transport, there are actually actions under 3 different themes in the CSP and DP. Why is this a problem? The problem is that councils are complex enough without jumbling up the way we describe what we do, why we do it, what it costs, and where the concerns are. If these things aren't clear, then your council and community can't grapple with the key decisions. The good news is that the New South Wales Parliament changed this section of the Act in 2016, making clear that council's activities do include implementing strategies in the CSP, but primarily council's focus in the delivery program should be performing its functions. Remember, that's the distinction I was emphasising from the start of the Act. So what am I suggesting then? Rather than starting with why we do it from the CSP and categorising actions, what we do, and the DP into these themes, and then having the budget and resourcing strategy over here categorised based on traditional program areas, and ending up with this confusion or lack of alignment between what we do and what it costs, I'm saying that council should start, as the Act does, with its functions, what we do, and then you can clearly align what it costs and what assets support those services, which is, of course, the resourcing strategy. It's funny because this traditional IP&R diagram actually highlights the problem here too. The link between the delivery program and resourcing strategy is not at all clear. The resourcing strategy just sort of sits off to the side like we're not sure what we should do with it. There is absolutely no reason why this should be the case. If you start with council's functions like transport, then the resourcing strategy will directly support what's in the DP, which is exactly what Section 404 has emphasised from the start. The DP had to be developed with an eye on the resources available in the resourcing strategy. It's just that it was hard to do that until there was clear alignment between the two. So where does all this leave the CSP? How do we relate council's functions in the DP and the strategies in the CSP? The answer is that it needs to be a matrix relationship that distinguishes the strategies in the CSP, which is the community's plan, and council's functions in the DP, which is council's plan. And how are they related? Let's look at transport. Transport is related to all of these traditional quadruple bottom line themes that feature in most CSPs, be it improving pedestrian access for people with disabilities, ensuring our structures over major watercourses don't impede fish passage, increasing heavy vehicle productivity, or advocating for investment on national highways and rail lines. The transport function, in some respect, addresses all of these. In fact, all the quadruple bottom line perspectives in the CSP are relevant to all the functions of council. Ironically, this is something that was lost when councils pigeonholed their functions into a particular theme, or worse, made infrastructure a separate theme. And we engineers need to be clear about this to avoid the trap of viewing assets as an end in themselves and not something to deliver outcomes to the community. But it's equally important, if not more so, to be clear on this. We can thank the accountants that have always been clear about where the money goes. Council budgets are generally organised into functions or programs, and in fact some councils, the best place to understand what's going on is to look in the budget. But we need the actions in our DP to be aligned with this, so our DP as a whole is clear about what we do and what it costs, including meaningful levels of service measures. In my view, this is the most important outcome of this updated approach to IP&R. But what if you can't convince people that it's important enough to change? This is where we should return to the Act. You've seen this a few times now. The object of the principles is that councils carry out its functions in a way that facilitates local communities that are strong, healthy and prosperous. But what are the principles? To pick out some of the key ones, councils should carry out their functions in a way that provides the best possible value for residents and ratepayers. Best value isn't about doing everything and keeping everybody happy all the time. It's about making hard decisions, doing this instead of that, or only doing so much of this, demonstrating objectively what you can afford to do. How do you undertake this exercise if you're not clear on what you do and what it costs, what the levels of service you can afford to deliver? Secondly, the Act reinforces that the IP&R is about outcomes and improvements, not just planning and reporting. Brad Burns, GM at Cabonne Council, makes an important point that it should be called IP&R. IP&R needs to be focused on delivery. It needs to be a tool to hold people accountable for performance and driving business improvements and so outcomes in the community. Last but not least, the Act establishes principles of sound financial management. Council spending and investment in infrastructure should be responsible and sustainable. This is hard, so don't make it harder. The implementation of all of these principles will be hampered if Council is unclear about what we do, what it costs, and what assets we've got. The interesting thing for engineers and asset managers is that these ideas align perfectly with the framework defined in ISO 55000, the International Standard for Asset Management. ISO defines assets as anything of value, tangible or intangible, financial or non-financial. And it defines asset management as activities to realise value from those assets, which echoes the principle and even the language used in the Act I mentioned earlier. All of this means that ISO 55000 is effectively a management system covering any and all functions of a council, not just those related to infrastructure. The other insight ISO 55000 provides is in relation to its two key documents. Firstly, the Strategic Asset Management Plan. ISO says this is about converting organisational objectives to asset management objectives. Obviously, if there's a need for conversion, there's not a straight one-to-one relationship, which is exactly the issue we can see councils have been grappling with in IP&R. The second key document is the Asset Management Plans. ISO says AMPs are about detailing the activities, resources and timescales to achieve asset management objectives. So in effect, if assets are anything of value, then all business plans across all departments of a council can be understood as AMPs. This is what I've just helped Cabonne Council with. They've called them department plans because there's one for each department. It's been an incredibly valuable exercise to have a consistent approach to business planning to inform their next cycle of IP&R. This approach has helped to address some of the key challenges I see councils grappling with in IP&R, and I'll go through these briefly now. The first challenge is getting clear integration with council's risk management framework. That's the thing about organisational objectives. They don't just come from the CSP, but are related to things like legislative compliance and other issues that aren't in the CSP or certainly aren't there in sufficient detail. The second challenge I often see is making council's objectives, in other words, its levels of service, SMART, as in specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time-bound. The third challenge is integration with council's project management framework. The business planning process should be driving the identification of both operational and capital projects, and as projects progress through the stages of project management, initiating, planning, implementing, controlling and closing, they should be in the context of the IP&R cycle as a whole. But often it's not, and projects only pop into IP&R when they need council funding for delivery. Last but not least, there's a number of related issues around who the audience for these documents should be, what level of detail you should include and how often they should be updated. The best way to explain how I see them fitting in with the rest of IP&R is to explain it in the context of the asset management system defined in ISO 55000. Firstly, like IP&R, it starts with stakeholder needs and expectations, which includes the CSP. But ISO also reinforces the need to understand the organisation and its context. Things like legislation, the labour and contracting markets, corporate risks, council's current operating structures and systems, these won't rate a mention in the CSP, nor should they. They are council issues. These are both the drivers of council's organisational objectives. which are then converted into actions in the DP and its 1-year version, the OP, which means the DP is equivalent to the first key element of the SAMP in ISO. But there's a need for action-oriented internal documents for each area, somewhere to do the more detailed planning than what's in the DP and OP adopted by Council. These provide the detail behind the DP and OP. Remember the definition of AMPS from ISO I mentioned earlier? The AMPS is supposed to detail the activities, resources and timescales to achieve asset management objectives. In other words, their primary output is your rolling capital works program. Of course, you're always forced to make assumptions and there are always gaps in information. I would strongly encourage you to state these clearly in your AMPS, because these should be informing your improvement actions. It means the person who picks this up next time is clear on what you've done and how you've come up with your figures. This is why I'd strongly suggest to you to keep your AMPS as an internal document. There is no requirement that these are adopted by Council or made publicly available. Look around the whole of New South Wales. How many AMPS on Council websites are up to date? Even if they are, who is reading them? This is something I realised after I wrote my first set of AMPS back in 2014 while I was a director at Coffs Harbour. No one reads them. That's why I went away from the idea for a few years in favour of high-level summaries in service dashboards, which have a place, but there's a need for this detailed analysis and planning that sits behind your DP and OP. These AMPS should be updated annually ahead of the OP, not once every 4 years. The improvement actions in them should be going into your employee performance plans, and their primary purpose should be helping your leaders to plan and deliver value in their areas and make improvements, which is a key reason they should be internal, so you can air your dirty laundry in them. And all of this will make them the engine room of IP&R. Of course, like any management system, ISO then has a do, check, act step after the planning and reinforces the need for a management system to support implementation and improvement. ISO says the SAMP needs to outline the asset management system, so this is another element of it, but I'd suggest this sits in a formal asset management strategy that is part of the resourcing strategy, along with the long-term financial plan and workforce plan that is adopted by Council. All of this framework should be established in Council's asset management policy. And of course, it isn't a one-off exercise, but needs to be an ongoing conversation about how Council can deliver the best possible value to residents and ratepayers. And it's here I'd like to return one final time to the amendments in the Act. Originally, the Act only required councils to have a community engagement strategy for the development of the CSP. Again, this figure shows the problem. It's assuming the CSP will tell us everything we want to know. There's no engagement specifically about the DP or OP or resourcing strategy. But in 2016, the scope of the community engagement strategy was expanded, and it now must include everything Council does other than routine administrative matters. But what constitutes meaningful engagement? Firstly, we need to be clear with the community about what we do and what it costs, and this includes meaningful levels of service. I'd argue that many councils are falling short in terms of transparency and accountability because this simply isn't clear in their current IP&R. Secondly, it isn't sufficient just to get a telephone survey done and ask for feedback on the importance and satisfaction with council services. I can tell you now that in every survey, in every council I've seen, libraries rate is low importance, high satisfaction, and roads rate is high importance, low satisfaction. But that doesn't mean that council should close all its libraries and throw all its money into the roads. Best value means having to choose between this or that, not having your cake and eating it too. It also means that we as engineers are making implications of decisions clear in terms of performance, cost and risk. If this isn't happening, then people aren't making informed decisions. Performance and cost together are generally about willingness to pay, and this is what you should be informing council's reporting in the new agreed level of service in your annual State of the Assets reporting, the old Special Schedule 7. while risk is generally something for council itself. It's not so much what's affordable, it's what council is willing to accept in terms of its risk appetite. As such, this should be informing your reporting on your backlog, which I'd define as something you should have renewed already, not what you'd like to be able to do if you had more money. Similarly, the required maintenance should be about what level of funding is required to effectively manage risks. So there's a lot in all this, but I hope I've provided you with a different view on what IP&R is about and inspired you to take a leadership role in it at your council. If I have, there's 3 things to take away. 1, the relationship between the CSP and DP needs to be a matrix. This is what's in the Act. If it's not the case, then the DP can't be structured around council's functions, and you won't be clear about what council does and what it costs. 2, the DP needs to be supported by internal action-oriented working documents focused on delivery and improvement, like Cabon's department plans. No one is reading your AMPs. There is no requirement that this level of detail is provided to the community or adopted by council. AMPs have the potential to be the engine room of IP&R, but you need to be clear about what your assumptions and improvement actions are. 3, the conversation about best value is what will set the direction for your council over their next term and beyond. Our role as engineers is to help people understand the implications of their decisions. Don't just sit back and wait for the community to tell you what they want in the CSP. You need to be helping councillors and the community to grapple with the trade-offs to be made between levels of service and willingness to pay, and to understand the short and long-term risks of a particular strategy. Yes, this needs to be backed up by the AMPs, but don't think anyone is reading them. You need to find meaningful ways of telling that story. I think this is the most interesting and rewarding element of the whole of IP&R, because it's what will change outcomes on the ground. But it will have to wait for another presentation because I'm out of time. So best of luck with it, and of course if you'd like some help with this, or even if you'd just like the rest of your executive and other key staff to hear this presentation, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.